On February 14th, 2021, one of the worst snowstorms and temperature drops in its history hit the state of Texas. Wreaking havoc for 3 more days, the storm caused billions of dollars in damage and shined a light on the independent Texas energy distribution grid. We're going to take a look at what happened with these massive failures in energy distribution and power, as well as similar cases in California and their causes. We're going to speak to experts from all sides of the issue to determine what happened and how these cases relate to climate change now and in the future. This is Energy4, Transforming Power. The recent storm in February in Texas shined a light on the state's power grid and its failure to provide electricity to millions in what was one of the most severe temperature drops in the state's history. But this isn't a new problem. California residents have suffered through extensive power outages and rolling blackouts for years, most recently during the summer of 2020 as blazing wildfires and high temperatures related to climate change hit the state. We'll explore these failures and get a better idea of how the grid operates, especially as our power generation changes. There are 4 factors affecting the distribution of power. Renewable energy, nuclear energy, fossil fuels, and the grid are all accelerating the transition to sustainable energy for our planet. On this show, we will talk about these factors, their impact, and even the preservation of our planet. Former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Neil Chatterjee.
A lot of Americans, they hit the switch, the lights come on, and we take for granted what all goes into that simple act. The electric grid in the United States of America is probably the most sophisticated invention ever created by man. But a lot goes into maintaining and managing that invention. It used to be regulated. Here in Texas, for instance, utilities charged consumers enough to recoup their investment and make a little profit. Consumers benefited from reliable and affordable delivery of electricity, and state regulators ensured that there was a balance in that relationship. But over the past couple of decades, we've actually moved to competition in electricity markets. Generators now compete against each other, and when you inject competition into a market, it drives down prices, increases efficiencies, and here in America, we've seen markets deliver tremendous benefits to consumers, to the economy, and to the environment.
So obviously this is very technical. There's machines, there's generators, there's energy, but there's a very human element to this entire situation. My mother, her house was completely obliterated in the recent polar vortex. I grew up in the house. We moved in there when I was 13. So I spent a lot of time there, but it's gone now.
I'm so sorry for your family's loss. So many others lost as well, including their lives. This was a genuine humanitarian crisis, and there were many, many failures. All forms of generation failed, whether it be coal, nuclear, natural gas, renewables, didn't perform the way they were supposed to. Yeah, that's our foremost responsibility, is getting to the root cause to find out what went wrong. And clearly, many things went wrong, and make sure it doesn't happen again. Why did this occur? Was it a problem with the market design? Was it a problem with Texas being independent and isolated from the rest of the grid? Was it because Texas doesn't have a capacity market for insurance in these kinds of situations? Or is it because investments weren't made in winterization after the last cold weather event nearly 10 years ago? These are all complicated questions that we really need to carefully examine to make sure that when this type of event happens again, and it is inevitable that it will happen again, that we're better prepared so that families, folks like your mother, don't go through the same suffering that they went through this time.
So winterization seems to be kind of the buzz term surrounding all of this. To the everyday person, the layman, how do you explain winterization?
So we're here in Texas right now, and this grid was designed to withstand intense heat in the summers. And there are trade-offs there. There are steps that you can take to invest in winterizing your system that may actually cause greater complications in the summer. And so this is going to be the focus of FERC and ERCOT. We've got to figure out what steps weren't followed, what investments weren't made, and why, and understand what we can do better next time.
You mentioned a couple acronyms in your last response, such as FERC and ERCOT. Would you mind explaining what those are and what their role is in energy?
So I mentioned competitive markets, competitive wholesale markets in electricity. ERCOT is an independent entity here in Texas that oversees that competitive market here in Texas. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where I am currently a commissioner, we oversee the country's wholesale electric markets, these competitive markets. Interesting twist, though, because of Texas's independence, we do not oversee ERCOT's market. Texas is unique in that it's a big enough state that it's got the population to drive demand for energy, but also has such an abundant supply that it can meet that demand. Now, there have been calls for some people saying Texas should be interconnected. Texas should be subject to federal jurisdiction. And it'll be ultimately a decision for Texans to make.
Are there other grids around the nation in a similar state of peril anywhere else across our country?
Here in Texas, a very conservative state, we had an unexpected cold weather event that clearly tested the grid and demonstrated that there were some failures. California, very progressive state, had an incident this summer due to extreme heat and wildfires that also threatened its grid, led to rolling blackouts and similar calamities. And so in the face of climate change and the threats that it is going to pose, it is more important than ever that policymakers, regulators, and the American people start to recognize that the grid is critical, and we need to make sure that it is resilient in the face of the increasing threats that are going to be posed by climate change.
It's important that we explore these issues from every side. I asked Commissioner Chatterjee to join me in discussion with some seasoned experts on the critical issue of energy policy. This is Pat Wood, past chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and the Public Utility Commission of Texas, or PUCT.
In 1995, George W. Bush appointed me to the Public Utility Commission, and he told me, Pat, the utilities that you will regulate care more about what we in the government think than what their customers think, and we're going to change that because that's wrong. We moved then to a competitive environment where we got generation out of traditional regulation and put it in the competitive market. And in most of Texas, we got the retail customers out to where they could be served by multiple providers, not just one monopoly regulated provider. And so 25 years later, that was a good gamble. We went from 21st most expensive state in electricity to 43rd, number 6 nation in the world in wind energy attached to the grid. Solar energy's right on its tail. Just in the last year, we're probably going to double this next year over what we had last year. But we had 2 events, one in 2011 and one exactly 10 years and 13 days later in 2021, that showed us that we're not as reliable as we need to be. And this one, this time, was very much a much deeper impact on customers than we had even just 10 years ago. That's a number of points of vulnerability on the gas system that, again, are being investigated now. Were any of those below the standard we need to maintain the reliability? We went from a 20 billion cubic feet per day production at the beginning of Valentine's Day down by half to 10 BCF. That affected the whole country because Texas supplies so much natural gas for the whole central part of our continent. So that impact was very deep. And so we've got to look at this system and better understand it. We've got about 30,000 megawatts of wind turbines throughout the state. A lot of it in the panhandle of Texas, but increasingly more and more on the coast. But a wind turbine can be winterized in a couple of ways. You could winterize the blades by the coatings and also by even have heat filaments in the blades. and importantly, winterize the actual generator inside the nacelle. We've got a lot to learn from our northern states, but I do understand that the things you do to help things survive the winter also make your plant less efficient in the summer. And so summer's when, again, we've historically designed the Texas system to be ready for the summer peak, but now that we've got to think about the winter peaks being almost equal. Our coal-fired plants, we had some trip-offs as well. We had coal actually freeze, little chunks of coal sitting outside in a big pile. They got rain. That rain was freezing. It froze on contact. Just like the rain froze on contact on the wind turbine blades, it froze on contact on the coal piles. And you have to basically chip it away like you would chip out ice for an igloo. You have to chip it away and then ultimately pulverize. That coal has to be pulverized into a powder.
This is Dr. Scott Tinker, Director of the Bureau of Economic Geology and Professor of the Department of Geological Sciences, both at Jackson School of Geosciences.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at Texas and California and compare them. Summer, California, heat waves, fires, grids failed. A lot of reasons for that. Combination of fuel mixes and policy and the way the grid is structured. Texas, the big chill happened. And we have a very different grid here. It's ERCOT. It's designed to kind of be an energy market in the sense that when you need things, you pay more for them. And it's not connected to anything else. So when the big chill happened and lots of different fuels had issues, we weren't ready for that. So our grid failed. A really careful analysis is needed to look at the reasons behind both so we don't overreact. Yeah, Texas is a big state, and we're blessed with a lot of different forms of energy. Natural gas, coal, 4 nuclear reactors, lots of wind, growing solar, even some potential geothermal. So a portfolio matters. And Texas has a portfolio of energy options for electricity. Not connected to another grid, sure. If they were able to provide electricity at an affordable price in that time, maybe we could have used some, but that wouldn't necessarily have happened. It wouldn't necessarily have solved it. It didn't work in California. California imports about 25–30% of its electricity from neighboring states, and they pay a lot for that. And those big fires and that drought, the other states needed it more. California couldn't pay enough. So they had rolling browns and blackouts. So it's not necessarily how big your grid is. It's really how it's all structured to work together. You know, a lot of things did fail, but when and how much is really important as you look at the actual data. I've been fortunate. I visited South Texas Project and Comanche Peak. I visited Parish Power Plant. These are massive facilities that provide baseload power, dispatchable electricity into a grid. If you look at from February 1st to about February 16th, that first week of February, things are pretty normal in Texas. Natural gas, nuclear, and coal provide quite a bit, and then quite a bit from wind too. So you're looking in that 40 gigawatt range, normal times in the winter. First week, wind's coming and going like it does. Nuclear steady on, coal kind of coming and going, and then natural gas following that load tremendously like it does. Now it starts to get cold. So around February 8th, temperatures began to go below freezing, and they were forecast to stay that way for a while, and they did. So we went for a week. Now what happened? The wind and the solar, which were there doing their winter thing, cut more than in half. You know, the sun's low on the horizon in the wintertime. The days are short. The panels were covered in snow, and it was cloudy. We didn't have any sun. The wind started to freeze up fairly early on, some of the turbines, so you couldn't get the electricity from them. Some stayed on, but much lower. Nuclear level for a week, coal level for a week, and natural gas started filling the gap. Kept getting colder. The demand went higher and higher to 67 gigawatts. Our absolute peak winter forecast max demand by day 7 of that cold spell. We matched it, we met it, and it was thanks to natural gas. Every day, natural gas rose more and more and more. It more than doubled until day 7, Valentine's Day. And then it stayed cold. So you saw a pump for cooling water in South Texas Project freeze up. They couldn't circulate water, took a reactor down. Coal piles started to freeze. So those baseload dispatchable sources went off, natural gas as well. But it fell from its high, which is more than double where it normally is, to still more than it usually is, about a 30% fall. And wind and solar effectively went away on February 15th. blackouts started and things got expensive. So it matters not just what, but when. Very important to understand that. And for several days, we had the blackouts.
We wanted to dive a bit further into the grid and its fundamentals. To do this, Commissioner Chatterjee and I spoke with experts, Dr. Adam Sobel, professor and climate scientist at Columbia University, Gretchen Baki, author of The Grid, and finally, John Wellinghoff, 2011 FERC chairman.
Yes, it was in the first week of February 2011 that there was a very severe event throughout the full Southwest. We did do a report. It was rather extensive and detailed. The causes of the outages that occurred that were a direct result of the cold weather, ultimately it was because the generators, 67% of the generators ultimately had some issues with weatherization. The other part of the outage was actually the natural gas side of the supply. A number of gas wells basically just froze up, or water that was being extracted from those wells could not be, in fact, taken away from the wells because the roads where people had to travel to go empty the tanks were so icy they couldn't get to them.
What were some of the recommendations that FERC and NERC made to Texas, to the Southwest, for what generators ought to do to avoid this kind of thing in the future?
Well, we made extensive recommendations. We made recommendations with respect to weatherization of the generators, with respect to the gas wells and the wellheads as well. But the one thing I want to make clear is that FERC did not then and does not now have direct jurisdiction over those generators and their maintenance and operation activities, or the wellheads either.
In your view, is it time for ERCOT to come under FERC jurisdiction?
Certainly, if ERCOT was strongly interconnected into SPP, into MISO, into the WEC, it would not have had as severe events as it did. It makes no sense for ERCOT to be an island. I think it's time for them to join the rest of the country.
There's no way you can have a conversation about the grid's impact on people without factoring in climate change. And I would love to get a sense from you on your views on the role that climate change may have played in these instances, and if we can expect more such extreme weather instances to challenge the grid in the future.
In the case of the California wildfires, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that those are becoming more frequent. We've seen them becoming much more frequent and much more intense than in recent years. And the evidence is pretty compelling that climate change is part of that. It's actually happening faster and more extremely than climate scientists had predicted. We always thought wildfires would get worse in a warming climate. It seems to be happening more so. So there's some things we definitely don't understand about that, but we expect that in a hotter climate where water evaporates more quickly off the soil and off, wood that's on the ground, that we'll have more severe fires. With some other kinds of events, heat waves, for the same reason, it's pretty simple. It's warmer, so we have more heat waves and more severe ones. And those stress the grid just because everybody's turning up the air conditioning. With hurricanes, the evidence is a little less clear, but we're pretty convinced they're getting stronger, even though whether they're happening more frequently or not is something we're still debating pretty intensely. And then you have events like the Texas one, where the evidence is really pretty murky at best. So in the Texas case, it was a cold event, and naively you'd expect, and the evidence in fact shows that cold events are happening less severely and less frequently because of climate change, because it's warmer. But there's a somewhat counterintuitive argument that the jet stream is getting wobblier as a consequence of warming of the planet. And so as it dives south, which is how you get these cold events, the cold polar air comes south behind a wobble of the jet stream. And there's an argument that that's happening more frequently as the climate warms. There's still significant debate over that in our community, but I'm not convinced by it. I don't think the evidence supports it very strongly. So in my view, the Texas event is not a climate change driven event as far as we know now. But that, of course, doesn't mean we shouldn't be prepared for it. We've seen that these events happen. Obviously, they've been happening for years. The Texas event was comparable in magnitudes to one that happened in 1989 and others that had happened in previous decades. So it's not that cold events are going away. They're still going to be there, and the grid has to be ready to deal with them.
It really is the story of the electric grid in the United States. How it is that we got the grid that we had in the 1970s and how we really started to push it around in integrating renewables, in integrating finance, in demonopolizing the utilities. I wanted to see why it was that it worked that way. And then the other half, the second half of the book really is like, what is a microgrid? Why do we all talk about storage all the time as though it's sort of the holy grail?
What's your view on the human impact, and how do you think things are going to go moving forward?
People had to think really, really fast about how to not make the situation worse than it was. And some of the decisions that they made in that fast thinking were wrong. But there is still a grid in Texas, right? And with some poor, very quickly made decisions in slightly a different direction, you would not have power right now, and we would not be having this conversation. Yeah. But while that was happening, in my home state, Oregon, there was also one of the biggest blackouts in the history of the state due to a giant ice storm, which got no press at all. Part of my question is, why is it that some power outages move us and move us to action? Like, they move us emotionally, but they also move us to action, and other ones don't. I think it's really important to think about the ways in which electricity systems can change, because we're changing them all the time. So instead of this feeling of like, I know what a grid is, it's just this thing that like, it's just there, and I turn on the lights and then I have light and I pay my bill and I don't really know why, right? To think about the ways in which, for example, in Texas, one of the things that we saw was all of this community support that came out when the power was out and then when the water was out, right? And people were really proud of their ability to go and say, I helped my neighbors. I know who on my block needed something. We all got together, and as a community, we made it through this. And I think we can say, how can you take that idea and bring it to the level of infrastructure?
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Energy4, Transforming Power.